I want to welcome you again to another lecture in this course, Social Welfare History. And before I start giving the lecture, I'll just like to give you a context. The textbook that you are reading for this course has so many chapters, and we're not going to be able to read, or you are not going to be able to read all the chapters. So what I have decided to do is that while I have assigned some chapters to you, I have decided to give you lectures on some of the chapters that you are not going to read, so that they can bridge your knowledge between the chapters that you have read and those that you have not read. So this lecture is going to be an overview of the introductory chapter in the text that you are reading. And essentially what we're going to be covering is general overview of issues in U.S. social welfare history. So this is just going to give you an overview. I'm not going to take too much time on it because it's just going to give you kind of a general idea of what you are really getting into in the course. Okay, so the first thing we're going to be discussing in this section, because I've decided to subdivide the introductory chapter into several themes, and the first one that we're going to be discussing is the value of social welfare history. So one of the things that the first chapter of the book addresses is, what is the value of social welfare history? Why should you care about it? Is it important? Okay, I know that if you are taking this course, you're a social work major, but so probably you are just taking it because you're preparing yourself to be a professional social worker. But even if you are not a professional social worker, there are certain important reasons why you should study social welfare history of the United States. And even if the person listening to this is not an American, there are certain lessons that somebody can still draw, because even though we have differences in culture and the political system and things like that, but there are still certain things that we share in common as human beings. And I think when I was reading the chapter and preparing this outline, I could see very, very clearly that the themes in the chapter are very relevant, or in the book are very relevant for other societies such as in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Okay, let me proceed. The value of social welfare history. One, studying social welfare history and policy helps us understand misconception of past generations. One of the things that you're going to encounter in the textbook on U.S. social welfare history is that you're going to see that there are a lot of sometimes misconceptions of people in the past about what it means to be human or what other human beings are. For instance, you're going to see some misconceptions about who Native Americans are. And the reason why this conception is really very important is how you think about somebody affects the way you relate to them. If I truly consider you to be a full human being like myself, I cannot say I'm entitled to something easily and deny that to you unless I have come up with some reason to justify the fact that even though you are as human as I am, or I am as human as you are, I can have this or you can have it and I cannot have it. So the way Native Americans or the way black people were treated, or the way immigrants, if you like, were treated, and when I say immigrants, I do not mean people coming from Asia, Africa, or Latin America, but even people who came from Europe. You're going to see in the book that many of them went through a lot of challenges because initially they were misconceived. Okay, and we're going to see that part of the reason for that is simply because many people think the Anglo-Saxons are the core group in the United States. Anglo-Saxons are generally Northern Europeans. Okay, the second point is social welfare history, or taking this course, helps us to understand what is new in our current policies. So if you pay attention to this course really very, very well, you will see what we call the progress that this country has made. It is true that we are not a perfect country, and we are not saying that we have gotten everything right. But when you look back, in spite of any imperfection that you might see now, you will see that, oh my God, we have made significant progress, because at one point, this is how some people were treated, but now this kind of treatment will not be possible. So remember how, for instance, in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, when George Floyd was killed, and how it generated a lot of demonstration across the United States and in some parts of the world. And a lot of the people who demonstrated were white people, not just minorities. It shows you the progress we have made compared to the time in the past when certain racial minority groups were treated, okay? And then third, it helps us educate professional social workers on the best strategies for engaging a client. As you read this text, you're going to learn a lot about minority groups, the diversity and the similarity across these groups. But as you get to know more about these groups, it will help you as a professional social worker to relate to them. So for instance, if I study someone's history or if I know something about you, it helps me to relate to you very effectively. Often when I do not know people, for instance, as a person, I am very careful to talk with them because I'm not sure what kind of orientation they have or things like that. And I'm very concerned I don't want to offend anybody. So if I know, however, what somebody is, I know, for instance, what his or her sensibilities are, it's easier for me to communicate with them because I know this is where they are coming from and I can relate to them really very well. So in the same way with regard to history, if you know something about the culture of the people, the history or what they have gone through, then as a social worker, it will help you relate to them in a more effective way. And then fourth, it helps us as social workers understand the social forces that brought the social worker, and the client together. What does this mean? Social welfare history would help you to understand that if you are in an office and let's say either you are a white person meeting with a minority person or you are a person of color but you are working with a person who is white and things like that as a client, if you study social welfare history because you know the broader issues in society that are operating that can push people into difficult situations or circumstances beyond their control, it will be easier for you to relate to them in the office, okay? So if I have an idea of what's going on in the country or the history and how it is impacting people, the economics, the politics, it's going to be easier for me to relate to a client. So that's one of the advantages of this course because it will teach you that. And then point number 5, social welfare history illuminates what political and economic forces and what kinds of ideas, values interacted to shape institutions. So when you look at the institutions that we have in the United States today, our democracy, our institutions of higher learning, our healthcare system, our judicial system, and so many other systems, you're going to find out that these things did not just happen like that, or they did not come into existence like that. Do not assume that people just prayed in this country and then one day they fasted maybe for 3 days and then the sky opened and then all these things came down from the sky or from heaven. No, it was different groups of Americans who came together in the form of social movements, struggle, okay? For instance, there was a time when workers did not work just 8 hours per day, okay? It was struggle by workers that brought that into existence. You know the civil rights movement, you know the women's rights movement, and all those kind of things, okay? Even people with disability, you know that there was a time when they did not have those rights, they had to struggle for that, okay? So how these ideas about the flourishing of human individual brought people together and shaped the kind of institutions that we have is something that you are going to learn in this course. And then point number 6, how the political and economic forces shape the development and evolution of social welfare policy and how they were reformed. So, for instance, in this course, you are going to find out that the Great Depression, which was from 1929 to 1933, played a very, very important role in shaping public policy in this country. Social security came out of that, and there are so many reform policies, social welfare reform policies that came into existence. You're going to see that even, for instance, the amount of money you put in your bank, it is insured. The bank has to insure the money. That's also very important. There was a time if you put your money in the bank and then something happened, then you lose the money. But nowadays, up to a certain amount, if you put in the bank, no matter what happened, the money is insured. So you're going to get at least that money really back. So the point I'm just trying to make here is just how when you understand how political and economic forces like the 2008 Great Recession, it has brought some impact, or for instance, the social welfare reform policy of 1996, it brought changes in policy. So in In this course, you are going to see how the political and economic forces shape the kind of policies that we have. You cannot understand public policies related to social welfare without understanding economics and politics. And then 7, the goals of welfare, social welfare policies reflect the values and goals of the larger society. So what does this mean? What this simply means is just that policies do not just come from nowhere. It is the values of the people in the society. If there was a time when in the United States, children were roaming the streets, hungry, begging, okay? But today, if this were to happen, people will just feel offended that something like that is really happening. If you see children like that, we feel like there must be something wrong. Maybe here and there you see some adult people trying to beg, but to get children, people will feel like there's something wrong about that, okay? So the point that is just being made here is just that the values of a society are reflected in their social welfare policies. For instance, we do not have universal health care in the United States compared to, say, Canada and other advanced industrial societies. And that's a reflection of American values. There are many people who feel that if we are going to have universal health care policy, which means everybody who is a citizen in this country would have access to health care, whether they have insurance or not, whether they're employed or not. Some people would feel that is a violation of intrusion, government intrusion in their rights or something like that, you see? So our values shape the kind of policies that we have in the country. And then in the United States, you're going to find out as you read the text that there's a tension between U.S. social welfare policies and goals, and the dominant between U.S. social welfare policies and goals and the dominant cultural values of the country. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that, for instance, is the issue, for instance, on the one hand, the redistribution of resources. What this simply means is, if we are going to distribute resources in society, or we want to make sure that everybody is doing very well, should we have a policy in the country that says that through taxation, for instance, we're going to make sure that people who make certain amount of income pay certain taxes, and those taxes are used by the government to help the poor, okay? That's a redistribution, because some people make quite a lot of money, and then they pay taxes, and then those taxes are used to pay, for instance, for children who cannot afford to pay for lunch, who cannot afford to have lunch in school or something like that. They cannot buy it, so they are provided with that kind of food. So should we rely on government doing that? And that means redistribution through taxation, or should we just rely on the market? Relying on the market simply means the government is not going to do anything. The government is just going to create a conducive environment for people to compete. And when they compete, whatever you earn, you take care of yourself. So in other words, the market will be the process through which resources are going to be distributed in society. This is kind of like what we discussed much earlier about merit, okay? Ability plus effort. So the idea is that we're just going to create a society, we're going to create a level playing field and then allow everybody to compete. If through your ability and effort you are able to get very much, that's fine. If not, then we're sorry. You have to find a way to cope with yourself. The idea is that this will bring some kind of discipline in the lives of people, because if I know that I'm responsible for myself, there's no any social welfare policy. Some people would argue that that makes people to feel disciplined. Okay, the other thing you're going to learn also is that the tension between the status of private property versus public goods. So what does this mean? Talk about public goods first. Public goods means goods that are available to every citizen, okay? When you are traveling from one city to the other in the United States, you have these rest areas. In these rest areas, which are paid for by government money, anybody can use them. You don't have to pay any amount of money. You can just use them. Similarly, the roads that we drive, if you're going to drive to Washington, D.C., or you're going to drive to California from Minnesota, the roads are there for everybody, okay, to drive. These are all public goods. Our K-12 education is a public good in the sense that any child in the United States has access to K-12 education really free, okay? So some people believe that if you want to have a society that is fair, just, and helpful to the flourishing of every human being in that society, we need a lot of these public goods, okay? We have public libraries, for instance. So if you want to get educated, sometimes you do not necessarily have to go and buy the book. You can go to the library and get all those. Okay, there are a lot of public libraries. So should we rely on that, or should we rely on private property? Private property simply means you have to pay and get that property. If you don't have the money to pay, then that means you cannot have access to that property. So in some places, sometimes if you're driving on highway, you have to pay toll gate. So it means if you don't have the money to pay the toll gate, there's a limit to how far you can drive, because after you drive a certain distance, you'll have to pay the toll gate. So private property is this whole approach to human welfare, saying we should just rely on that. The government should not provide these public goods, because when we talk about public goods, it is through tax money. When we collect our taxes, then the government use it, okay, to build airports, to build roads and other things like that, okay? Okay, so there's a debate here, there's a tension here. There's a part of the United States that feels that we need public goods, because public goods helps particularly people who are disadvantaged. But some people feel that, no, the government should not use public money to provide all these goods. If people want these services, they should buy it themselves, which means relying on their private property or resources. Okay, then the next is social realities that shape our political system. Through social welfare history, you're going to find out that there are certain social realities that shape our political system, such as economic crises, wars, and civil disorder. So what does this mean? After George Floyd, and for those of you who are not familiar with George Floyd, this was somebody who was killed in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, and then by a police officer, and then it generated a lot of reaction from the general public. So I'm not here talking about the demonstration and in some cases the destruction of some people's private property. But what I'm trying to draw your attention to here is how that crisis has compelled many public institutions to re-examine themselves. What I mean by re-examining themselves, some of them have decided to change the name of their buildings that were bearing the names of some white people that probably owned slaves. Some organizations took it an opportunity to re-examine how are they treating minority people in their organizations and things like that. So you see, it was a crisis, but that crisis has contributed to certain changes. And then economic crisis, right now we are going through some economic crisis because inflation is rising very high and some other things. And in 2008, you remember when we had the mortgage crisis, some people lost their homes and all those kind of things. So all those kind of things introduce certain policies aimed at helping people, okay? So, and then you have wars. Wars are important in shaping social welfare history because you remember that the New Deal, for instance, the New Deal came after the Second World War. There was these programs to help veterans, like in housing, in education. Like many of the veterans who came after the Second World War were subsidized; their education was subsidized, and things like that. And then fair housing also housing was also subsidized for a lot of veterans, okay, which led to U.S. suburbanization. So the point I'm just trying to say here is just that these crisis situations, if you check very carefully, and you're going to see in the textbook, they force us to re-examine our society and bring about some changes. And then the intent of social welfare programs can be deduced through how the needy are perceived in society. So what does this mean? When you read the textbook, pay attention. You're going to find out that one of the things that is clear throughout U.S. history is that how we perceive the needy shape the kind of policies or social programs that we create for them. What do I mean here? Essentially, what is being said is that if you see the needy as lazy people, if you see the lazy as stupid people, in the past history of the United States, there was a school that was created for the idiots, okay? Now, if you create a school for the idiots, definitely you have a perception of these people. That's why you decided to create that school. So there are people, however, sometimes who need help, but they are not perceived as people who are either idiots or lazy. And I'm not using these terms because I believe them or anything, but I'm just describing to you what you will find in the text. So there are people who get into economic or financial trouble just because of some problem beyond beyond their ability to control or something like that. So sometimes those kind of people are treated differently. For instance, if somebody is needing social security or something like that, they are treated differently compared to somebody who's just looking for help, not social security or whatever, because somebody who's getting something through social security, most likely they have done some work, they have earned some credits and things like that, okay? So there are differences in terms of the way the needy are treated based on the way we perceive them. Are they lazy people? Do we see them as irresponsible people, or do we see them as people who have just found themselves in circumstances beyond their control? And then the structure of the U.S. government also complicates social welfare issues and matters. So what do I mean here? When you are reading this textbook, one of the things you're going to see that is very important, and I want you to pay attention to this also, is that throughout the history of the United States, we have this kind of tension between what is the balance of power between the federal government, the state, and even counties. Because sometimes you might find a situation where some counties are in tension with the government of the state, especially sometimes if the party is different or something like that. So a county might decide to say, we're going this direction, and in most cases, unless they violate the law, the governor cannot do anything, or the attorney general of the state cannot do anything, even though they may not like what is really happening. And so similarly, there are sometimes tension between federal control and then state control, okay? We're going to see that there was one president of the United States who vetoed a bill that was passed, which was obligating the federal government of the United States to take the responsibility of social welfare in the past, okay? He said social welfare is the responsibility of the states. So that's another thing. And then there are times when, for instance, the New Deal, the language of the New Deal is very neutral, racially neutral. But when it was sent to the states for implementation, because some of the states, like in the South, had all this Jim Crow discrimination or whatever, they implemented that New Deal law, which the language of which is racially neutral, but they implemented it in a racially discriminatory manner, okay? So pay attention to this tension between the balance between states and federal governments. And you saw this very clearly during the pandemic, while some governors tried to challenge the federal government on certain requirements, okay? Okay, and then you're also going to see that throughout U.S. welfare history, social welfare programs and services are carried through the involvement of private and public organizations. So U.S. social welfare services are not just provided by the government. There are private agencies. And the interesting thing is that some of these private agencies are not for profit, but now we have even for-profit private agencies that are involved in providing social welfare services. But when they do that, a lot of their funding comes from the federal government, especially those for-profit organizations. They receive funding from the federal government. So it's like the state or the federal government hire these private agencies to carry out some of these or to execute some of these social welfare policies. So social welfare policies are not just provided by the government, but there are voluntary agencies that are involved, and there are profit-making organizations that are also involved in that. And then the other thing that you also need to take into consideration is the study of social welfare history will demonstrate the growing professionalism of the profession of social work and the increased training of the professionals. So what are we saying here? What we're saying here is just that throughout this book, you're going to find out that the requirements to be a professional social worker have changed. In the past, they may not be very demanding, but today, they are really, really very, very demanding. For you to be a social worker, you have to have some appropriate training, you have to get a license and all those kind of things. And if you look at the competency areas today in social work, to become a social work professional and to get a license, you have to adhere to all the competency requirements. And some of these competency requirements might make some people uneasy, because some people sometimes feel privately they can discriminate against other people who are of different religion or different sexual orientation and things like that. But the competency requirements of social work today require that if you are going to be in that profession, you have to be prepared to see the human dignity of all. You cannot discriminate against them just because you disagree with their lifestyle or something like that, like their sexual orientation is different or their religion is different, and then you say, okay, I'm going to deny you these services simply because you are not a member of this particular religion. So what I've gone through so far is, or are, the value of social welfare history. I have summarized to you all the things that you will learn, or the reason why social welfare history is really very, very important.